Hey friends, tonight, let's explore why someone in medieval Europe might think the best way to start building a holy site was to bury a chicken under it. Yes, really a rooster to be precise. Feathers, beak, talons, and all entombed beneath stone as the foundation was laid. You'd think that sounds like a poultry-themed prank, but this was serious business back then. So before you settle in, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the content here. And if you're listening from somewhere with cobbled streets, roaming cats, or the faint echo of a distant bell tower, drop your local time and place in the comments. I'd love to know when and where we're dreaming together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the cool gray hush of a building site. Not a modern construction zone with flashing vests and loud beeping trucks. This one's medieval. Dirt floor, wooden scaffolding, and the slightly chaotic energy of a dozen workers arguing over where to put the sacred doorframe. The year is, well, somewhere around the 12th century, give or take a crusade. In front of you, the earth's been dug out in a neat rectangle, a trench meant to be the foundation of a church. But before any stones are laid, before a single sermon echoes off its soon-to-be walls, there's a ceremony. A small crowd gathers clergy stonemasons, maybe a noble patron with a fur-lined cloak and a very bored squire. And at the center of this gathering, a rooster. It's not running around. It's not crowing proudly at the sky. It's dead, recently, and respectfully placed into the trench. Why? Well, here's your historical fact for tonight in certain regions of medieval Europe, especially in the Germanic and Slavic zones. It was believed that burying a rooster beneath the foundation of a church would protect the building and its congregation. Think of it as spiritual chicken insurance. This wasn't casual superstition. It was part of a ritual, a sanctifying act, a way to bind earth blood and prayer together. Roosters were chosen not just because they were common livestock. These birds had a reputation. In Christian symbolism, the rooster stood for vigilance, faith, and the triumph of light over darkness. After all, it crows at dawn like a feathery alarm clock for the sun. In folk belief that crowing had power, it could banish evil, dispel spirits, even wake the spiritually drowsy. So burying one was symbolic. You were anchoring the church with a creature that never slept on the job, well, metaphorically. It's sort of like building a fortress and asking the ghost of a guard dog to watch the gates. But here's the quirky detail. Sometimes this ritual got a bit dramatic. In one 14th century account, the rooster was not just buried, but placed in a small wooden box carved with crosses. In others, the priest would sprinkle holy water on the bird first. There are even whispers that occasionally the rooster wasn't entirely dead yet when it went into the ground, which makes this less of a PG-13 bedtime story and more of a, we'll say, ethically complicated offering. And now for your academic curveball. Some scholars argue that this tradition didn't originate in Christian practice at all. They think it's a remnant of pre-Christian sacrificial customs, pagan rites, that were later absorbed and baptized into church rituals. Animal offerings to appease spirits of the land, or even blood magic to ensure strong walls and safe worship. Others insist the symbolism was always theological, not folkloric, just a highly visual metaphor, misunderstood by the peasantry. The debate's still going, usually between people wearing sweaters with elbow patches and strong opinions about symbolism. Meanwhile, the workers keep building. Stones are stacked, prayers are murmured, and the rooster sleeps beneath it all, forever, guarding the faithful above. And that's how some churches were built on a bird. 3 gentle chuckles before we end. Imagine explaining this to a modern city inspector. Yes, sir, structurally sound, and we did include the standard poultry blessing. Somewhere in the afterlife, there's a rooster who thinks he's the patron saint of construction. And if you ever feel like your job's underappreciated, just remember, some chickens literally held up a whole church. The crow at dawn. You're in bed, or what counts as one in a 13th century village. Straw mattress, wool blanket, maybe a few moths who've claimed squatters' rights. Outside, the sky is still that deep shade of blue that says, absolutely not yet. But suddenly, through the mist and chimney smoke, and the suspiciously loud yawn of your neighbor's goat, a sound pierces the silence. Caw-roo-coo-roo-roo. Nope, not a rooster, with stage fright that's a full-throated medieval morning alarm. And with that one echoing crow, every demon within a 2-mile radius is supposedly sent packing. Tonight's historical fact. In medieval Europe, people genuinely believed that a rooster's crow had power beyond just telling you it's time to trudge to the fields. It was thought to chase away spirits of darkness, to cleanse the air of evil, and to announce that light, both literal and divine, had returned. Roosters were like spiritual referees. Once they crowed, the night was officially over, and all shady beings had to retreat until dusk. The roots of this belief go deep. In the Bible, the rooster famously crows 3 times as Peter denies knowing Jesus. That detail alone launched 1,000 sermons. For medieval theologians, the rooster's crow was a call to repentance, a warning bell, a symbol of divine timing. But beyond Scripture, the folk world had its own rooster rules. You sit up on your straw mattress now, rubbing your eyes, and peer out the wooden window shutter. There's a faint glimmer of gold on the horizon. No electricity, no clocks, no phone apps reminding you of anything. Just the rooster doing what it's always done, make noise, like its entire personality depends on it. And somehow, you trust it more than any calendar. Here's something delightful. Some households in medieval Europe didn't just keep roosters for eggs and alarm clocks. They kept them as house guardians. It was common to let the rooster roost near doorways, under beds, or even up in the lofts, especially if someone in the home was ill or recently passed. Not for warmth or companionship, but because it was believed the rooster could detect and drive away invisible threats. Ghosts, malicious spirits, a whiff of plague with too much ambition. There's even a story from a 12th century Flemish text about a village that brought their rooster into the local chapel every evening just to ensure no demons stayed past sundown. Talk about a feathered bouncer with a spiritual resume. But of course, not everyone agreed. Which brings us to our academic point of gentle contention. Was the rooster's power symbolic or supernatural? Some historians argue that the crowing was just a convenient metaphor part of liturgical storytelling, and not something anyone truly believed had ghost-busting capabilities. Others point to local rituals and surviving charms as proof that people genuinely saw roosters as protectors against evil, not just morning singers. One monastery record from 1294 even mentions a sacred cock that was blessed and allowed to roam freely in the cloister gardens. Not because the monks had a fondness for bird-based chaos, but because they believed its presence kept the devil disoriented. Honestly, that's impressive. We have security cameras now. They had chickens with holy clout. A few places even built little rooster statues into their door frames, tiny stone carvings perched above archways. You probably wouldn't notice them unless someone pointed it out, but they're there, perched in silence, frozen in crow. And if you ever wondered why the tops of old weather vanes are shaped like roosters, it's not just because they're flashy birds with excellent wind resistance. It's because the rooster was thought to keep watch in every direction, always facing the unseen threat. The sky, after all, wasn't just for clouds. It was also where angels and demons hung out on their coffee breaks. Before we wrap up, let's leave you with a mental image. A medieval farmer, half awake, stepping outside into dewy grass. He bows slightly, not to the sun, but to the rooster on the fence post. A bird with no idea how holy it's considered, proudly fluffing its feathers and preparing to scream again at full volume. And now 3 soft chuckles for your dreaming pleasure. If roosters really chased away demons, then rural Europe was probably the most spiritually secure place on earth. Somewhere, a rooster is furious that we invented alarm clocks without feathers. And yes, the devil might flee at a rooster's crow, but so would any medieval person trying to sleep in after sunrise. A sacrifice in feathers. You're kneeling beside a freshly dug trench. Not the dramatic kind from a war story, no. This one's shallow quiet, about the length of your arm, and only as deep as an ambitious root vegetable. Around you, a circle of people stands in reverent stillness. Monks in rough robes, villagers in muddy boots, one architect with a waxed beard that screams, commissioned by the bishop. In the center of this circle, a basket. Inside the basket, a rooster that's having a very confusing day. Tonight's historical fact: the ritual burial of animals, particularly roosters, beneath sacred or significant buildings, wasn't isolated to one village or one denomination. It was part of a much older pan-European practice that combined pre-Christian folk traditions with rising Christian symbolism. The rooster wasn't the only animal to be buried beneath a threshold, but it was certainly the loudest. And yes, some of these birds were sacrificed. Not just dead, ritually prepared, offered in theory to God. But scholars still scratch their heads over which God and whose theology we're talking about. Here's where things get tangled. In Christian doctrine, blood sacrifice was considered fulfilled and ended with Christ's crucifixion. So technically, any post-Christ sacrifice should have been theologically frowned upon. Yet here we are, with written records and oral histories describing the burial of animals, especially roosters, goats, and sometimes even pigs, at the foundations of churches, bridges, castles, and even wells. You shuffle a little closer. The priest raises his hands, murmurs a Latin blessing, and the rooster's fate is sealed. A quick motion, merciful, ideally, and then the bird is wrapped in cloth, anointed, and gently placed in the earth. The stones will follow. A church will rise here. A century from now, pilgrims will walk these floors unaware that beneath their feet lies a rooster with an honorary role in spiritual real estate. Now, for your quirky sidebar: in some Slavic regions, instead of sacrificing the rooster, people believed it should be tricked. That is, you lure the bird into the trench with grain, cover it quickly with stones, and by not technically killing it, you avoid divine punishment. The logic is a bit murky. It's like a legal loophole for nervous believers. The rooster wasn't killed by people you see. It was simply overwhelmed by masonry, accidentally on purpose. This is where academia wades in with its usual delightfully inconclusive debates. Some anthropologists argue that this entire practice is evidence of cultural carryover from earlier Indo-European traditions. They point to parallels in Norse Celtic and Baltic sites, where animal bones, especially birds, have been found in the foundations of longhouses and temples. A kind of symbolic blood binding to ensure the strength and stability of the structure. A life exchanged for protection. Others suggest it's less pagan and more psychological. In an era of shaky construction methods and unpredictable disasters, burying a living thing, especially something as noisy and symbolic as a rooster, gave people a tangible sense of control. You couldn't predict a fire or a collapse, but you could at least say, well, we did everything we could, even buried a rooster. The church, interestingly, had mixed feelings. Some records scolded the practice as idolatrous superstition. Others tolerated it, perhaps thinking better to let the villagers bury a bird than revert to older, wilder deities. There are reports of bishops quietly attending such ceremonies, eyes averted, but hands unprotesting. One chronicle from a Bavarian abbey tells of a master builder who refused to start a cathedral until the rooster had been buried at the eastern foot of the nave so the sun may greet the watcher first. Poetic, slightly macabre, deeply medieval. As the trench is covered and the first stones are placed, the air shifts, not in a dramatic thunderclap sort of way, just a subtle hush, like everyone feels a little more certain, as if the ground has accepted its charge, as if the rooster's final duty is to keep watch. Forever. Time for your gentle trio of laughs. In modern terms, this would be like sacrificing your Wi-Fi router so your house never loses signal. Somewhere a chicken ancestor is muttering, "You buried who under the church?" And honestly, if I knew my job was to keep a building standing with spiritual chicken power, I'd need a raise in breadcrumbs. When stones remember, you're brushing your fingers along the base of a weathered church wall. The stone is cool, pitted with time, and still faintly damp from the morning fog. You're not a pilgrim, not exactly. Just a sleepy wanderer with a habit of looking too closely at old things. And today, something about this particular wall catches your eye. Not a carving, not a relic, just the unsettling feeling that there's something underneath it waiting. Tonight's historical fact in medieval Europe. Church foundations were sometimes more than just stone and mortar. They were memory vaults, places where objects, animals, and even people were deliberately placed beneath the structure to anchor it spiritually and symbolically. The buried rooster you've heard about, he wasn't alone. Sometimes it was coins, sometimes bones, and sometimes, well, let's just say not everyone who vanished during construction ended up in the pub. The idea that a structure could remember isn't so strange when you live in a world where everything is spiritually charged. Walls weren't just barriers, they were guardians. Foundations weren't just supports, they were seals. So placing something beneath them wasn't superstition, it was insurance. Emotional, magical, possibly theological. You imagine the mason's apprentice squinting in the morning light, trowel in hand. He's been told today's work includes laying the cornerstone. But before the stone goes down, a small bundle is passed to him, cloth-wrapped. It smells faintly of feathers and old ash. The priest mutters something. The master mason nods. The bundle is placed. Then the stone. Done. And that little moment never mentioned again. It wasn't just churches. Bridges, castles, even large barns were sometimes planted this way. The rooster was a favorite because it straddled worlds. It was both mundane and mysterious, both dinner and divine metaphor. but anything could be used, so long as it held meaning. A coin stamped with the local ruler's face, a vial of holy water, a lock of hair. The key idea was permanence. Once you buried it, it stayed. You didn't move it. You didn't disturb it. To do so might invite collapse not just of stone, but of fortune. Now for the weird historical tidbit of the evening. In parts of medieval Scandinavia, it was believed that certain stones remembered the blood spilled on them during construction. If the foundation stone of a church had once been stained with sacrificial blood, it might grow warm on holy days. That's right, stones with moods. And people recorded it like weather reports. The nave wall was warm this Easter, which bodes well for the barley harvest. Not spooky enough. In a 15th century folktale from central Germany, there's mention of a church where the rooster buried beneath it continued to crow from underground every year on the spring equinox. Most likely a metaphor, possibly an acoustical fluke. Definitely nightmare fuel. Now here's your academic hair splitter. Historians don't fully agree whether these stories represent common practice or regional folklore exaggerated over time. Some argue there's no consistent archaeological evidence for rooster burials beneath churches. Others counter with written accounts, liturgical records, and, well, bones. Lots of them. Found just where you'd expect under the eastern walls near the altar or beneath the entrance threshold. And then there's the practical angle. Did people just bury things there to prevent tampering, a way to mark sacred ground, in a time when blueprints were scribbled on wood shavings and prayers were your best structural adhesive? You pause your exploration. The stone you're touching feels no different now, but your mind is racing. Somewhere beneath your feet might lie a creature offered up centuries ago as part of a sacred architecture. No plaque, no tombstone, just a chicken buried in the name of eternal protection. 3 gentle giggles to finish. Imagine if modern buildings had foundation mascots. Ah yes, this skyscraper rests on the noble remains of a taxidermy pelican. Somewhere a medieval chicken contractor is muttering, "I laid that cornerstone myself." And if stones could talk, they'd probably say, "I don't forget. I'm just very quiet about it." The Cockatrice paradox. You're flipping through a dusty bestiary in a monastic library. The air smells like parchment beeswax and quiet disapproval. Behind you, a monk sneezes so delicately you're not sure if it was real or imagined. But on the page in front of you is a creature that stops everything, half rooster, half dragon. And apparently one look from it can turn you to stone. Introducing the Cockatrice, possibly the worst roommate in any medieval allegory. Tonight's historical fact: many medieval Europeans believed that if a rooster laid an egg, already alarming, and that egg was incubated by a toad or a serpent, it would hatch into a cockatrice, a creature so cursed it made demons nervous. Its stare could kill its breath, could wither crops, and yes, it probably ruined soup just by walking past it. Which brings us to a delicious contradiction. On the one hand, roosters were buried under churches as sacred protectors. On the other, they were occasionally blamed for hatching dragons. It's like your security guard is also on the watch list. And this wasn't niche mythology. It was widespread, appearing in texts from England to Italy, France to the Holy Roman Empire. The paradox here tickled theologians and terrified villagers. You wanted the rooster's holiness, its symbolic link to light and vigilance, but you didn't want it laying surprise apocalypse eggs, which biologically it can't. But biology in the Middle Ages was less peer-reviewed journal. and more brother Gerard said he saw it once behind a barn. So how did the myth gain traction? Partly, it was rooted in a deep misunderstanding of natural science. People in the medieval world were fascinated by spontaneous generation, the idea that certain animals could arise from filth decay or very bad luck. Rats from old rags, frogs from mud, and monstrous beasts from ill-fated poultry. The Cockatrice's popularity also boomed because of its symbolic potential. It was a creature born from disorder inversion and unnatural processes, a male laying an egg blasphemy, a toad nurturing life double blasphemy. No wonder the end result breathed death and wore scales. You look up from the manuscript and imagine the poor villagers hearing rumors that someone's rooster had been behaving strangely, maybe crowing backward, or walking in circles, or worst of all, sitting. People would panic, and sometimes they'd destroy the egg or the bird just in case. And yet, churches kept using roosters in their symbolism. Weather vanes, stone carvings, ritual burials. Why? Because despite the rumors, the rooster remained the herald of mourning the bird that announced light's return. Its darker reputation only added to its spiritual gravity. A creature that touched both ends of the moral spectrum. Here's your academic quandary of the night: was the Cockatrice myth a cautionary tale about unnaturalness or a metaphor for spiritual vigilance? Some scholars argue it was a symbol of sin's twisted nature, something once good a rooster turned evil by transgression, unnatural birth. Others believe it reflects the church's struggle with controlling folk beliefs, absorbing their fears into grander theological narratives. And the real curveball. There are actual medieval legal records in which people were fined or worse for allegedly raising a cockatrice. One French village in the 1400s reportedly burned an egg suspected to be laid of cock and brooded by demon wind. That's a level of poultry paranoia that even modern HOA boards would struggle to enforce. Let's close tonight's entry with 3 drowsy giggles. Somewhere in the Middle Ages, a rooster was probably like "guys, I crowed, I didn't conjure." Imagine being tried in court because your chicken sat too long. She's either nesting or plotting the end times. And now, you'll never look at an omelet the same way again. Holy clocks with wings. You're standing in a village square, barefoot on cobblestones, still holding onto the night's chill. There's no church bell yet, no town crier, not even the sound of carts or hooves, just silence until it comes. A single note, wobbly and defiant, slicing through the quiet like a feathered herald declaring war on sleep. The rooster crows, and medieval time officially begins. Tonight's historical fact before mechanical clocks spread widely across Europe. Many towns, monasteries, and households relied on the humble rooster to mark time, especially that slippery sacred hour known as dawn. Long before apps and sundials and miniature astrolabes, it was the bird that told you when to pray, when to work, and when to start regretting yesterday's bread decisions. Roosters, after all, have a reputation for punctuality. At least, in theory. Anyone who's ever actually owned one knows they can be delightfully inconsistent, occasionally crowing at the moon shadows or because a worm looked at them wrong. But medieval people gave them the benefit of the doubt. Because what other creature stood every morning on the edge of the dark and dared to yell into it? Now here's the quirky detail of the evening. Some monasteries, especially in France and northern Italy, had official rooster watchers. A brother assigned to sit quietly through the wee hours and wait for the first crow. When he heard it, he'd ring a bell or knock on the dormitory door, signaling matins, the first prayer of the day. That's right. The monastic schedule often began not with a clock, but with a bird. You picture this bleary-eyed monk wrapped in a rough wool cloak, leaning against the cloister wall, with a half-frozen candle stub and a look that says, "If that rooster doesn't crow soon, I might." A sacred job, yes, but also one deeply reliant on poultry cooperation. And the rooster's role didn't stop there. Villages set their rhythm to it. Bakers started their fires. Millers opened sluice gates. Farmers gauged whether it was early enough to slip out and check on sheep without bumping into witches or worse neighbors. Churches embraced the symbolism. That's why you'll often see rooster-shaped weather vanes atop steeples. They weren't just whimsical decorations, they were functional icons. High up facing the winds, crowing silently for eternity, a reminder to watch, to wait, and to call out the dawn, even in storms. Here's a fun contradiction that medieval folks didn't seem to mind. The rooster was both noisy and holy. In an era where silence was seen as sacred, particularly in religious settings, the rooster's call was allowed, celebrated even. It was considered a divine interruption, a natural sermon from feathers and beak. But this leads to a rather curious academic squabble. Did the church elevate the rooster's status because of its usefulness, or was it retrofitted with spiritual meaning after people relied on it so much? Some historians argue that symbolism came later, that the rooster was simply a village necessity turned icon. Others believe the opposite, that the rooster's biblical link to Peter's denial gave it immediate theological weight even before it became the farmyard alarm clock. Either way, the result is clear: the rooster became the feathered timekeeper of medieval Europe. One English church in the 14th century even kept a live rooster in a bell tower as part of its daily routine. Not for bell ringing, of course, although the mental image is incredible, but because people believed his crowing helped keep evil at bay and ensured punctual prayers. Eventually, mechanical clocks arrived, then more accurate ones, then bells, then personal timepieces. But the rooster never fully vanished. His shape remained. His voice echoed in idioms, and his legacy lingered in both weather vanes and stained glass. So next time you hear that familiar crow in the distance, remember you're listening to what once passed for a divine schedule update. 3 clucks of amusement before bed. Somewhere in heaven, a medieval monk is still whispering, "Crow, you feathered beast, I'm freezing out here." The rooster may have woken the village, but you know someone still hit snooze by throwing a turnip at it. And let's face it, the only thing louder than a rooster crowing at dawn is a rooster that crowed at the wrong dawn. A Tale of Two Beaks. You're sitting on the edge of a fountain in a quiet hamlet courtyard. The morning sun is filtering through a crooked cluster of trees. Roosters are squabbling in the distance and across the square. A hen struts by with the air of someone who's late to a meeting only she knows about. She stops, scratches, then vanishes into the shadows of a half-timbered stable. And suddenly, you remember not all churches buried roosters. Some buried hens. Tonight's historical fact: while roosters were the most commonly mentioned sacrificial birds for foundation rituals, historical and folkloric accounts from Eastern Europe and the Balkans reveal that sometimes hens were used instead. Yes, hens quiet, less dramatic, and arguably more productive members of the poultry world, but their symbolic meaning entirely different. This opens up one of medieval history's lesser-known feathery feuds, rooster versus hen in the realm of ritual. So why the switch roosters, as we've learned, were associated with vigilance dawn and spiritual awakening. Hens, on the other hand, were linked to fertility, domestic safety, and the hearth. In places where the church served as not just a religious space, but the literal heart of the community, a place for shelter meetings and sometimes even food storage. The symbolic choice of a hen made perfect sense. You weren't just protecting the soul. You were blessing the village pantry. Some Slavic villages even believed that a hen buried beneath a new home, not just a church, would keep the family safe and prosperous. In Serbia, for instance, tales speak of white hens being especially powerful, innocent, sacred, and not known to lay dragon eggs, unlike their more flamboyant male cousins. But now, we arrive at a peculiar little contradiction. In areas where hens were preferred, roosters were often seen as too noisy, too proud, or even unlucky. That's right, depending on your zip code or haystack. The very bird celebrated in one region as a holy sentinel was considered a feathered nuisance somewhere else. You begin to see a pattern. The animal itself didn't change, just the story around it. Rooster, or hen the bird, was transformed into a symbol molded by the needs, fears, and values of each community. And that leads us to the scholarly squabble of the night. Was the variation in ritual bird due to theology, regional folklore, or simply the availability of surplus poultry? Some scholars say it was economic. Hens were more valuable for eggs, and so offering one in sacrifice implied a greater cost, thus a more meaningful act. Others argue the opposite, that hens were more common and disposable, making them the affordable holiness option for smaller communities. And then there's the gendered reading. Some modern historians, particularly those who study gender and ritual, believe the rooster versus hen divide reflected cultural views of masculine versus feminine protection. Roosters guarded against external spiritual threats. Hens offered internal nurturing power. One yelled at the darkness, the other warmed the home. Either way, both birds wound up under stone. There's a strange comfort in knowing that even in matters of ritual sacrifice, medieval people couldn't quite agree on what made a proper sacred bird. Some towns probably had entire feathery debates. You can almost hear it. We must bury a rooster. It sees evil before it arrives. Nonsense. Hens keep the eggs warm. I trust a hen more than I trust you. You're not invited to the next consecration. Eventually, these debates faded. The rituals disappeared, and the birds went back to their usual lives of scratching, clucking, and suspiciously eyeing worms. But beneath a few ancient stones, quiet, humble, long forgotten, those chosen birds still rest. One beak crowed. The other whispered, 3 soft pecks of humor before sleep. Somewhere in medieval Europe, there was probably a rooster union, angry about being replaced by hens. And yes, if hens kept laying eggs in the afterlife, heaven had better be very well stocked with omelets. The next time you eat an egg, remember it might be the quiet hero of someone's medieval foundation. Not just for breakfast. You're crouched beside a village hearth, watching as a woman cracks eggs into a clay bowl with practiced grace. A rooster watches too from a safe distance, suspicious and slightly offended. You'd think his only legacy here would be breakfast. But no. In medieval Europe, roosters weren't just part of the meal, they were part of the message. Tonight's historical fact: roosters played many roles in medieval life beyond the frying pan. From spiritual symbol to judicial participant, they strutted their way into law, art, folklore, and even feasts thrown by nobles, trying way too hard to be relatable. If you thought they were just loud birds, good for soup, oh, sweet listener, you've underestimated the full resume of Gallus domesticus. Let's start with the art. Roosters appear in illuminated manuscripts not just as decorative poultry, but as moral reminders. You'll find them tucked into margins beside psalms, crowing silently above the heads of saints, or even standing on the pages like they have opinions about theology, which frankly many roosters do. They were shorthand for wakefulness, vigilance, and spiritual attentiveness. But then it gets weirder. In parts of France and the Low Countries, there are records of roosters being put on trial. Yes, on trial, in actual courtrooms. Usually for crimes like laying an egg, which, as you now know, medieval folks took as a sign the bird might be hatching a cockatrice. There's one particularly strange 15th century account from Basel, where a rooster was accused of unnatural laying and brought before a judge. Witnesses testified. The bird was present. The verdict, guilty, sentence execution. If that seems absurd, you're not wrong, but it wasn't unique. Medieval courts sometimes tried pigs, rats, and goats for crimes ranging from crop theft to manslaughter. Roosters just had the added burden of magical suspicion. Yet despite this, they were still adored. On feast days, nobles and clergy sometimes hosted rooster races, yes, with actual prizes. In a 14th century Welsh manor record, there's mention of a rooster named Blessed Lord Grumble, who won a silver thimble for completing a lap around the alehouse yard. If that isn't prestige, we don't know what is. Roosters also showed up in mystery plays, public performances of Bible stories where they'd play themselves. The scene of Peter's denial always included a real bird, often placed backstage or under a bucket, with some poor apprentice waiting to lift it and poke the bird at the right time. You can imagine the chaos when the rooster either crowed too early or not at all. Divine drama feathered edition. But the crowning moment, pun intended, was the rooster's presence in royal symbolism. In France, the Gallic rooster eventually became a national emblem, though that took time. Early medieval associations with roosters often had more to do with personal devotion or community ritual than with politics. Still, the bird's status as the announcer of truth made it useful for sermons and sovereigns alike. So here's your academic head-scratcher of the evening. Why would a creature that was feared, adored, judged, and sacrificed also be treated like royalty? Some scholars think it's precisely because the rooster stood at the crossroads between night and day silence and sound superstition and faith. It was both mundane and mystical. The perfect medieval paradox. And let's not forget the everyday folk. Many villagers believed their rooster could predict the weather, locate thieves, or protect children from bad dreams. Some households gave their favorite roosters names, talismans, even burial rites. There's a record from Yorkshire in 1393 of a farmer who insisted his rooster receive a grave, a stone, and one prayer said on St. Stephen's Day. That's devotion. As the fire beside you crackles low, and the hen in the yard starts fussing about worms, you realize something oddly comforting. To be a rooster in medieval Europe was to be both feared and fed sacred, and silly trialed and treasured. 3 warm chuckles for tonight's tale. Imagine being a rooster at a medieval dinner, never sure if you're the guest, the dish, or the entertainment. Somewhere in the afterlife, a rooster is muttering, "I got blamed for a dragon egg I didn't even lay." And truly, if your alarm clock ever crowed and won a silver thimble, you'd never use your phone again. Cursed by Cockerel. You're sitting on the edge of a wooden bench, just outside the crumbling chapel wall of a half-abandoned medieval village. The air feels heavier here. The stones seem too still. And the locals. They lower their voices when they pass this spot, glancing sideways at the church foundation like it might blink. They say the rooster buried here still crows. Tonight's historical fact: in several regions of medieval Europe, particularly in the Alpine valleys and parts of eastern France, there were whispers of haunted churches, cursed buildings, and unexplained misfortunes, all tied back to a buried rooster. If things went wrong, a fire, a collapse, a string of unfortunate baptisms, it wasn't always blamed on human error. Sometimes they said the rooster under the stone was angry. That's right. The same creature entrusted to guard holy spaces could, if improperly buried or disrespected, become a source of supernatural unrest. And thus we arrive at one of the strangest branches of medieval folklore, the ghost chicken. You think that's an exaggeration? Not so. Some folk tales claimed that improperly sacrificed roosters, especially those buried hastily or not blessed by a priest, could return to haunt the church they were meant to protect. They'd crow from underground rattle foundation stones, or appear in dreams to the village priest, clucking ominous warnings about structural integrity. One tale from 14th century Burgundy tells of a church where the congregation kept hearing a muffled crowing during Mass. No live bird was ever found. Eventually, they dug beneath the altar and discovered the skeletal remains of a rooster wrapped in decayed linen. The priest reburied it with full rites, and the haunting stopped. At least, that's how the story goes. Either way, the locals avoided sitting near the front row for several generations. This leads to a rather hilarious and slightly sad pattern. Villagers who believed their church's problems stemmed from a disgruntled rooster. The fix exorcisms for the chicken. Some churches actually performed rituals to soothe the spirit of the buried bird, including lighting candles at dawn, sprinkling holy water near the foundation, or my personal favorite, whispering apologies through cracks in the stone. And now, the academic debate: was this all just folk paranoia, or did it reflect deeper anxieties about improper ritual? Some historians argue that the tales of cursed roosters were symbolic stories about what happens when sacred rites are rushed, corners are cut, or beliefs are mishandled. Others think the stories reflect tension between official church doctrine and rural practices, where local customs continued even as priests tried to standardize belief. Either way, the message was clear: don't mess with the bird. Do the ritual properly. Bless the feathers. Say the prayers. And for heaven's sake, don't skip the Latin. Of course, not all ghost rooster stories were angry. Some were mournful. There are lullabies from northern Italy where mothers sang about the sleeping rooster who lies under the chapel and wakes only when children cry. He listens, they say, and guards dreams. A feathered saint resting in the dark. And then there's the frankly bizarre anecdote from a Danish village where, according to a 15th century diary, the rooster buried beneath the church was dug up and rebaptized because the local priest believed it had converted to heresy. No, we don't know what that means. Yes, we desperately want to. 3 softly haunted laughs before sleep. Somewhere out there is a rooster still waiting for someone to say sorry for the sloppy burial. And if your house ever creaks at night, just remember, it's not always the wind. Sometimes it's poultry-related penance. Honestly, ghost chicken wasn't on anyone's medieval bingo card. but it absolutely should have been. The bell tower rooster. You're craning your neck to look up at the top of a church spire where something glints in the afternoon sun. It spins gently with the breeze, creaking like an old door that knows too many secrets. It's not a cross or a flag or even an angel. It's a rooster. And no, it's not decorative. Well, not just decorative. It's doing a job. Tonight's historical fact: from the 9th century onward, it became increasingly common to place rooster-shaped weather vanes atop church bell towers throughout Europe. These weren't just weather tools. The rooster was chosen specifically because of its deep biblical and symbolic associations. It was a guardian, a signpost, and according to more than one monk, a sort of metal bird watching for the end of the world. Let's rewind. You're in a small village in Saxony sometime in the 10th century. The church is being renovated, the steeple's getting taller, the bells getting louder, and the priest, who has a suspicious fondness for carpentry, is arguing with the blacksmith about the size of the rooster going on top. Not if it's a rooster. Just how big. The reason. In 820 CE, Pope Nicholas I, or maybe it was Pope Leo III, historians like to arm wrestle over this one, is said to have decreed that a rooster should be placed on every church dome or steeple. The bird was meant to symbolize Peter's denial of Christ, the moment when the rooster crowed after Peter denied Jesus 3 times. It became a visual reminder to stay vigilant, faithful, and hopefully more punctual. But the symbolism doesn't stop there. The rooster faces the sky, standing tall, fearless. It doesn't hide. It announces. It crows even when no one wants to hear it. In the medieval mind, that made it a perfect spiritual lookout. Placing a rooster on the highest point of a church meant it was literally the first to see the dawn, and metaphorically, the first to challenge the darkness. And yes, it helped with weather. Weather vanes had existed long before this era, but combining function with faith. That's very medieval. The rooster spun with the wind and pointed the way, giving villagers a quick glimpse of where storms might come from, while also reminding them to prepare their souls for whatever else might arrive. There's even one surviving weather vane from the 11th century in Brescia, Italy, that still bears a Latin inscription, reading Vigilat Semper. He always watches. Here's your quirky sidebar. Some weather vane roosters were massive. One example from 13th century Normandy weighed nearly 70 pounds and had to be hoisted into place using a combination of pulleys, prayers, and 3 very tired stonemasons. In a German tale from the 1400s, the rooster on a bell tower was so large that villagers swore they could hear it creak at midnight. No wind, just divine flexing. The academic debate tonight. Some scholars believe the rooster atop churches was never about Peter's denial at all. They argue that the symbol comes from earlier pre-Christian sun worship traditions, where the rooster's crow at dawn represented the banishment of darkness and evil. Placing it on sacred buildings then was simply a Christianized way of tapping into an older universal symbol. Others say, no, it's a clear and deliberate moral metaphor. The bird is up there, so we don't forget to stay alert. Either way, the metal rooster stayed, and it still does. In many European towns, church roosters are lovingly maintained, re-gilded every generation, and sometimes even blessed during special ceremonies. They're treated less like decoration, more like an old friend who knows too much about wind patterns and your spiritual hygiene. Now let's end with 3 breezy chuckles. Somewhere a medieval blacksmith is still bragging about how his rooster outlasted 4 bishops and 1 lightning strike. If modern office buildings had rooster weather vanes, Mondays might feel a little more epic. And truly, who needs a weather app when you've got a bird-shaped compass screaming into eternity? Feast day, feathers. You're standing in the middle of a village square where something truly unhinged is unfolding in the most orderly church-approved way. Banners flap, ale spills, and at the center of it all, a man in a feathered costume crowing, flapping and being very seriously chased by children with wooden spoons. It's not a breakdown, it's a festival. Welcome to the Feast of the Rooster. Tonight's historical fact: in several parts of medieval Europe, especially in France, Spain, and the Low Countries, certain feast days featured elaborate pageants and games involving roosters, sometimes symbolic, sometimes culinary, occasionally, surprisingly, dramatic. The line between religious observance and absurd bird cosplay was thin, and roosters were at the center of it all. These weren't minor events. Some villages planned for weeks. Livestock was set aside. Ale was brewed in excess. And the rooster? It had a role in the festivities that ranged from guest of honor to main course. One common ritual, especially during Shrovetide or pre-Lenten festivals, involved a game called cock throwing. Yes, it's exactly as troubling as it sounds. A rooster, usually tied or placed in a pit, would be the target of thrown sticks or stones. Whoever struck it down was declared the winner. Medieval carnival games where violence met poultry and somehow passed for entertainment. But not all traditions were so grim. In some towns, a live rooster was paraded through the streets, garlanded with ribbons, and given a place of honor at the church steps. Children would sing songs, clergy would offer blessings, and the bird would sometimes be freed at the end, a symbolic release of sins, or at least of feathers. Then there was the crowning of the rooster, a custom from rural Spain, where the bird was dressed in tiny fabric robes, tailored mind you placed in a makeshift throne, and paraded on a cart. The symbolism, likely a mix of satire, sacrifice, and spiritual metaphor, or possibly just what happens when you give medieval people beer and vague moral themes. One particularly whimsical record from 14th century Flanders describes a priest who used a rooster as a sermon prop during Lent. He dressed it in a tiny mitre, yes, a chicken in bishop's clothing, and used its crowing to punctuate his message about vigilance. The audience was reportedly very moved, and also very confused. Here's where the academic disagreement flutters in. Were these rooster-centric festivals holdovers from pagan fertility rites, or were they entirely Christian inventions designed to draw crowds and keep villagers spiritually entertained? Some scholars trace their roots to pre-Christian spring rituals, where roosters symbolized awakening and rebirth. Others argue the festivals were firmly within church-approved fun, using humor and community bonding as tools for reflection disguised in feathers. And we can't overlook the culinary angle. Feast days often ended in, well, feasting. And while one rooster might strut around in ceremonial glory, several others usually met a more culinary fate. Rooster stew, spit-roasted cock, or pies filled with shredded meat and spices were considered seasonal delicacies. The idea of eating the symbol you just celebrated didn't strike medieval folks as ironic. It was a way to internalize the sacred one spoonful at a time. Let's not forget medieval minds thrived on dualities, celebration and sacrifice, life and death, rooster and slightly crispier rooster. As the sun sets over the square and the man in the costume limps home with feathers askew and pride intact, you realize the rooster wasn't just a symbol of mourning. It was a full season entertainer part, prophet part, mascot, part entree. Now, for your 3 chuckles on the house, somewhere a medieval rooster woke up to applause, wine, and then the pot. Emotional roller coaster. Much. The next time someone throws a surprise party for you, just hope it doesn't end in stew. And if you ever feel ridiculous, remember, there was once a bishop's hat made specifically for a chicken. The rooster and the relic. You're seated in the back pew of a dimly lit chapel. Candles flicker along the walls, casting long shadows over carved saints who look like they've been judging you since 1284. The priest is deep into a sermon about miracles, real ones, official ones, the kind that come with a papal seal and maybe a ribbon. And then almost casually, he says, and then the rooster, though already cooked, stood and crowed. Wait, what tonight's historical fact in one of the most enduring medieval miracle tales, the miracle of Santo Domingo de la Calzada, a roasted rooster came back to life, stood up on a dinner plate, and crowed. This wasn't a metaphor. This was presented as factual evidence of divine intervention. And for a long time, it was one of the most famous pilgrim stories in all of Europe. Let's set the stage. A young man named Hugonel and his parents were traveling on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. They stopped in a town along the way, Santo Domingo. A local girl, smitten with Hugonel, tried to seduce him. He declined. She retaliated by planting a silver cup in his belongings and accusing him of theft. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to hang. Cheerful, right? But wait, miracle time. His parents, grief-stricken, visited his hanging body before leaving the town. They found him still alive, miraculously supported by Saint Dominic himself. Rushing to tell the local judge, they found him just sitting down to eat roasted chicken and all. The judge scoffed, "Your son is no more alive than these chickens on my plate." At which point, the chickens got up, fully cooked, headless possibly, still steaming, and crowed. This moment has been retold in song sermons, stained glass, and yes, taxidermy. To this day, in the Cathedral of Santo Domingo de la Calzada, you can find a small coop housing a live rooster and hen descendants in spirit, if not in blood, of the miracle birds. They live inside the church. They are fed. They occasionally cluck during Mass. And they are the only animals in Europe with unofficial saint-level PR. So why? The rooster, again, symbolism, of course. The rooster's crow has long been tied to truth revelation and the breaking of falsehoods. In this miracle, the bird is both divine exclamation point and proof of innocence. It's a resurrection metaphor, a justice metaphor, and possibly the world's earliest example of poultry-based courtroom drama. Now, for your scholarly egg to crack, did people really believe a cooked bird came back to life? Some argue yes, faith in miracles was strong, especially among pilgrims. Others say the story was allegorical, a dramatized lesson in faith and divine fairness, not meant to be taken literally. But then, someone did build a coop in a cathedral. That's not your average metaphor. The story spread far beyond Spain. Pilgrims along the Camino carried tiny rooster charms. Inns displayed paintings of the miracle. Even distant German manuscripts feature the tale, though in one version, the chicken reportedly winked instead of crowed. Interpretations varied. And the best part, the cathedral's coop tradition still continues today. Live birds, church-approved, with a rotation schedule to keep them fresh and feathery. Occasionally, they've escaped. There are reports of miracle chickens sprinting down the nave mid-mass, pursued by panicked altar boys and clapping tourists. Divine Comedy Medieval Edition. Let's wind down with 3 miracle tear chuckles. Somewhere in history, a chef was told the bird crowed, and he replied, "Well, then I clearly undercooked it." That moment when your dinner becomes the prosecution's star witness, only in medieval Spain. And truly, if your church has a chicken coop and a souvenir shop, you're either on pilgrimage or in a very specific dream. The Poultry Gospel. You're tucked into a corner of a cloister library where every scroll smells like beeswax and anxiety. Outside bells toll the hour. Inside, a monk in a slightly too tight habit is clearing his throat with the enthusiasm of someone about to deliver a point. He's not just teaching scripture. He's preaching about a chicken. Tonight's historical fact: in the medieval period, roosters regularly strutted their way into sermons, homilies, and theological metaphors. They became favorite symbols of vigilance, truth, repentance, and the thin line between spiritual awareness and barnyard volume. Church leaders, particularly in monastic communities, leaned on this loud little bird to explain everything from the fall of man to the nature of divine timing. Yes, the rooster was a walking sermon illustration. Let's start with Peter. Every monk knew the story. Peter denies Christ 3 times. The rooster crows. Peter weeps. In countless medieval sermons, this wasn't just a moment of failure. It was a symbol of spiritual wake-up calls. You could fall asleep in your duties. You could drift into sin. But the rooster's cry, sudden and loud, was mercy in disguise. A divine, "Hey, pay attention." But the allegories didn't stop there. In one 12th century text called Speculum Ecclesiae, or the Mirror of the Church, a chapter is devoted to the 5 virtues of the rooster. Yes, 5. Allow me to summarize. He wakes early. Be vigilant. He calls others to rise. Be a teacher. He crows louder when danger approaches. Be a guardian. He faces east. Seek the light. He claps his wings before he sings. Examine yourself before correcting others. That's not theology. That's poultry-based personal development. You turn the page and see a marginal illustration of a rooster wearing a monk's cowl. It's not meant to be funny, but it is. The artist probably had a chuckle too, right before being gently scolded by Brother Pryor for illuminated levity. There's even evidence that some preachers kept a rooster near the pulpit, a real one, as a sort of live prop or living metaphor. One account from 13th century England describes a particularly dramatic monk who would lift the bird at the moment of Peter's denial, causing it to crow on cue. When the bird refused, he simply mimicked the sound himself loudly. One can only imagine the reactions. Of course, not everyone was thrilled with these poultry performances. Some bishops scolded lower clergy for relying too heavily on animal symbolism, calling it barnyard theology, and accusing them of turning sacred teaching into livestock pantomime, which honestly sounds amazing. Still, the rooster persisted. It appeared in cathedral carvings, frescoes, even communion bread molds. In certain Italian churches, there were rooster-shaped pastries sold on feast days meant to remind believers to stay alert in their faith, while also being delicious. So, here's your academic angle for tonight. Did these feathered metaphors make theology more accessible for the illiterate public? Or did they risk trivializing sacred lessons? Some scholars argue that turning spiritual truths into animal parables helped bridge the knowledge gap. Others worry that after a while people remembered the chicken and forgot the gospel. One French abbot in the 14th century wrote, "My flock knows the rooster better than the Christ," which sounds bad, until you realize he also kept 3 roosters in the courtyard named Faith, Charity, and Alarm. As you roll up the scroll and stretch your legs, you realize medieval sermons weren't boring. They were vivid, loud, occasionally feathered, and surprisingly applicable to everyday life. And if you walked out of church thinking about your soul and your chicken coop, that's a win. Time for 3 soft clucks of amusement. Somewhere in heaven, a rooster is patiently waiting to be canonized for his service in 4,000 parables. The next time someone tells you they've got main character energy, remind them the medieval rooster was the sermon. And honestly, if your priest uses a live chicken in the homily, you're staying awake whether you want to or not. Dawn Duel at the Cloister. You're tiptoeing through a monastery courtyard, just as the sky softens from coal to lavender. The dew clings to your shoes, and somewhere nearby, a sleepy donkey sneezes. But your attention is elsewhere drawn to the growing sound of scratching, shuffling, and posturing. 2 roosters, locked in a stare-off beside the herb garden. One fluffs his feathers. The other tilts his head with the gravitas of someone quoting scripture. Neither backs down. And so begins the Cloister's unofficial sport, the Dawn Duel. Tonight's historical fact: while roosters were sacred symbols in churches and monasteries, they were also a source of entertainment companionship and, in certain settings, low-key rivalry. Yes, even monastic communities, those bastions of order and self-restraint, occasionally allowed their resident roosters to strut spar and well-settled disputes the old-fashioned way, with flapping and drama. Let's be clear, we're not talking about organized violent cockfighting. That was more associated with fairs and secular feasts. This was something gentler, more monastic. Think of it as poultry theater. A slow-motion scuffle between birds who had no idea they were performing for men who'd taken vows of silence but still appreciated a little morning flair. Many cloisters kept chickens as part of their self-sufficiency eggs, pest control compost, and the occasional spiritual allegory. But over time, certain roosters became favorites, named, watched, argued about. One 13th century Benedictine record from Provence notes that Brother Julian's rooster, Red Thomas, had a superior crow and disposition not to be tested lightly. It's always the quiet ones. Some monks even kept journals, tracking their rooster's behavior, what time they crowed, how long they fluffed, whether they behaved during vespers. In one Saxon monastery, it's said that the rooster would only crow if the abbot was on time for morning prayer. Coincidence, maybe. Divine poultry judgment? Absolutely. But let's talk about the duels. They weren't scheduled. They just happened. Usually at dawn. Usually after a particularly loud crowing session that turned into a posturing contest. Feathers would puff. Talons would click. One would charge. The other would dodge. Then both would forget why they started and wander off toward the cabbage patch. The monks watched. Quietly, of course. One monk in Lubeck wrote in his 14th century notes, "The roosters argued at sunrise. I too felt combative but chose tea." That may be the most relatable sentence from the entire Middle Ages. This brings us to the academic curiosity of the evening. Were these roosters genuinely fighting for dominance, or were they part of a loosely tolerated form of stress relief in the monastic setting? Some scholars argue that watching animals was one of the few acceptable amusements within strict orders. You couldn't gossip, you couldn't gamble, but you could observe poultry power struggles and draw moral lessons from them. Others point out that roosters were often used as metaphors in monastic writings. Their confrontations symbolized internal battles between pride and humility, noise and silent sleep and vigilance. A spiritual duel with feathers. One particularly poetic account from a Carthusian hermitage reads, "As the rooster challenges his rival with open wing and voice, so too must the soul challenge sin with discipline and courage." Or maybe the soul just needed more oats. Interpretations varied. You glance one last time at the two birds, now ignoring each other entirely, having decided that the cabbage was more interesting than conflict. Peace has returned, for now. Let's flap our way into three gentle giggles. Somewhere in medieval Europe, two monks probably bet 3 beans and a spoon on a rooster standoff without saying they were betting. Monks took vows of silence, but someone muttered, "My rooster's louder than yours." And honestly, if your biggest fight of the day ends in salad, you're living better than most of us. The witch's bird. You're walking along a narrow village path at dusk, the kind where the wind hums secrets through the thatched roofs, and every tree seems to lean in with gossip. A cat darts across the road. A door creaks somewhere behind you, and suddenly you hear it, a rooster crowing. At sunset, wrong time, wrong vibe, and to a medieval villager, very wrong omen. Tonight's historical fact: in certain parts of medieval Europe, the humble rooster wasn't just a symbol of holiness and vigilance, it was also associated with witches' spells and the darker side of folklore. If a rooster crowed at an odd hour, especially at night, people didn't say, "must be confused by the moon." They said, "someone's conjuring something," because apparently even chickens could be suspicious. Let's break this down. Roosters crowing at dawn, good, natural, symbolic of truth and divine order. Roosters crowing at midnight twilight or after a death, that meant something had gone wrong. People believed those untimely crows could signal the presence of witches' spirits or hidden sins. In more superstitious regions, it was even said that a rooster's unexpected crow could interrupt a curse, or worse, invite one. Some villages believed that a rooster crowing 3 times at night was a sign that a soul was being claimed by the devil. Others said it meant a witch's spell had just been cast. And if it crowed facing north, that was apparently the magical equivalent of sounding a fire alarm in the underworld. This made roosters both helpful and terrifying. On one hand, they were used to detect witches. If a household suspected foul play, they might bring a rooster into the room and observe its reaction. A certain flick of the tail feathers a sideways stare, or a sudden crow could be interpreted as confirmation that yes, Aunt Agnes might be turning milk sour with her mind. On the other hand, witches were also said to keep roosters as familiars. These weren't your average chickens. They were said to be gifted with supernatural sight, capable of sensing spiritual disturbances, or in some tales, acting as messengers between the witch and her unseen forces. If your neighbor's rooster always seemed to be watching you well, that might not be just poultry paranoia. And here's your odd historical detail of the night in 15th century Moravia. There's a recorded case where a woman was accused of witchcraft, partly because her rooster knew too much. According to the trial notes, the bird had crowed each night at the same time for 13 days exactly at midnight. No one thought to ask whether it was just lonely. They burned her bread oven instead. Close enough. Academically, this presents a contradiction. How could one creature be so revered in churches and so feared in alleys. Some scholars suggest this duality mirrors the tension between official religion and popular superstition. The church wanted the rooster to symbolize Peter and redemption. The villagers, living in a much messier reality, still saw it as a creature that bridged worlds between day and night, clean and unclean, sacred and shadow. You can see why the rooster kept showing up in both church art and witch trials. It had range. In Germany, a legend tells of a red-feathered watcher who served both a monastery and a witch. During the day, it crowed from the steeple. At night, it wandered the woods, delivering whispered secrets to a cloaked figure by moonlight. It was said the rooster betrayed neither side. It simply told the truth to whoever listened. And in Scotland, a belief persisted that if a rooster crowed on All Hallows' Eve, after dark, the veil between worlds was at its thinnest, and any spell cast within earshot would be 10 times more powerful or 10 times more cursed. Let's end tonight with 3 cackling clucks. Somewhere in the archives, there's a rooster, with the footnote possibly an accessory to enchantment. If your neighbor's chicken watches you through the window, just close the curtains. Don't ask questions. And honestly, any bird that crows at midnight should be forced to sit through its own trial, with snacks. The Midnight Cockerel. You're half asleep in a cottage nestled against the edge of a misty wood. The fire has died to embers. Your blanket smells faintly of thyme and sheep, and the only sound is the slow ticking of your own heartbeat. Until through the hush of the dark, a single sharp crow slices the stillness. A rooster. At midnight. You don't move. But your mind does. Because in the Middle Ages, a rooster crowing after dark wasn't just noise. It was a warning. Tonight's historical fact in medieval European folklore, an untimely rooster crow, especially one at midnight, was believed to signify death betrayal or the approach of something unnatural. Whether it was a spiritual visitation, a lurking curse, or the sudden guilt of someone harboring secrets. The Midnight Cockerel was less an alarm clock and more a feathered harbinger, and no one trusted it. Roosters were supposed to keep time, order, rhythm. A sunrise bird. But when they crowed after hours, especially in the deep hollow space between midnight and dawn, it was said to signal spiritual unrest. The kind that makes windows rattle. The kind that wakes dogs for no reason. The kind that made villagers sit up and wonder if someone somewhere had just met their end. You sit up in your straw bed, remembering that in some regions, particularly in southern Germany and parts of Hungary, people believed that the devil walked freely between midnight and the third crow of a rooster. If the bird crowed too soon, it meant something had gone wrong with the balance. The veil had shifted. Reality had hiccuped. In one 14th century folktale from Tyrol, it was said that a rooster, crowing at midnight, foretold the death of a child within the village. In another from Cornwall, it predicted a betrayal before sunrise. And in several Slavic tales, the crow disrupted witches in flight, forcing them to drop their potions or forget their curses mid-incantation. But not all stories were sinister. Some people believed that the midnight crow was a form of protection, that the rooster had sensed something dark approaching and had called out not to warn you, but to chase it away. In this version, the rooster becomes a guardian, patrolling time itself, breaking silence when needed. Still, it was hard to ignore the dread it brought. Here's your curious side note. In a few monasteries, particularly those in remote northern outposts, there were actual rules about roosters and nocturnal crowing. If a monastery's rooster crowed before matins, the early morning prayer, the prior might delay the service until it was confirmed by the stars. Yes, just in case the bird was premature or possessed. Now for the academic debate. Did people genuinely believe the rooster was sensing death and spiritual danger? Or was this just a way of explaining uncomfortable feelings in the middle of the night? Those sudden wakes chills or uncanny silences. Some scholars suggest the bird was a scapegoat for the very human fear of darkness and disruption. Others argue that in an era without clocks, any noise out of sync with expected patterns was simply too significant to ignore. And of course, we can't forget the sheer drama of it. In ballads and mystery, plays a midnight rooster crow often came at exactly the wrong or right moment. A lover sneaking out, a knight breaking an oath, a priest whispering a secret he shouldn't. The bird would cry out, and suddenly everything changed. Betrayals were revealed. Spirits were banished. Curtains were drawn tighter. There's a quiet beauty in the idea that one bird meant to announce beginnings could also interrupt endings. So tonight, if you hear a rooster in the wrong part of the clock, don't panic. But maybe, listen. 3 after dark chuckles before we slip away. Somewhere, a rooster once screamed at midnight just because it saw a spider and accidentally triggered a village panic. If you crow before dawn, you're either a prophet or about to get blamed for everything. And let's be honest, I was cursed by poultry would make a fantastic opening line for any medieval confession. The hen and the crucifix. You're in the back room of a small village chapel where the walls lean a little and the candlelight wobbles like it's unsure about staying. A woman sits across from you cradling a hen in her arms, not like livestock, but like confession. She says the bird saw him, her son accused of theft, and the hen she insists can prove his innocence. Tonight's historical fact in parts of medieval Europe, chickens, especially hens, were sometimes used in local superstitions and even folk trials as witnesses, omens, or divine validators. That's right. Not only did roosters wake up the village and predict storms, they occasionally served as character witnesses in accusations, especially in cases where the truth was hard to find and the stakes felt too high for silence. It sounds absurd, but it wasn't a joke. In more than one village tale, particularly from southern France, rural Germany, and Galicia, there are reports of hens responding to prayer or testifying in bizarre but meaningful ways. For example, laying an egg at a crucial moment, pecking at the accused, crowing somehow, despite being a hen. These signs were taken seriously, not as hard evidence, but as hints from the divine. One famous tale tells of a judge who refused to believe a young man's innocence. The mother, desperate, brought in the family hen, declaring that it would not eat or lay until the boy's name was cleared. The hen fasted for 3 days, an act seen as divine protest. On the 4th day, the judge reconsidered. The boy was released. The hen laid 2 eggs before lunch. Some churches even included chickens in their local legends. In a remote Tuscan chapel, a mural once depicted a hen at the foot of the crucifix, symbolizing humility and truth. She wasn't a symbol of power or purity like the lamb. She was just watching, present, bearing witness. Which brings us to the stranger side of all this. In some folk customs, hens were believed to possess an uncanny connection to moral truth. If you lied in front of a hen, it would know. If it clucked during a testimony, it was considered a sign of divine displeasure. And if it stared at you for too long, that's it. guilty. You look again at the woman in the chapel, her hen now resting quietly on her lap. The priest watches, too torn between doctrine and folklore, unsure whether to offer a prayer or just some grain. Here's your scholarly footnote for the night. Historians still debate how widespread this belief truly was. Were these isolated stories passed down for charm? Or did communities genuinely treat chickens as instruments of moral arbitration? Some suggest it was desperation, the desire for signs in a world full of uncertainties. Others argue it reflected a deeper medieval impulse to find justice in nature when human institutions failed. It's worth noting that animals were already part of the justice system in surprising ways. As mentioned in earlier tales, pigs, goats, and even insects were put on trial. So it wasn't such a leap to believe that a hen might help reveal truth as well. But beyond trials, there's another layer to the hen's reputation. She represented protection, especially maternal. Jesus himself references a hen in the Gospels, lamenting, "How often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings." That image stuck with medieval audiences. The hen became not just a symbol of domestic warmth, but of spiritual shelter, which is probably why, in some rare church carvings, you can find a stone hen sheltering chicks beneath her wings, tucked beneath the arms of a crucifix. A visual theology of grace, quiet, humble, feathery. Let's close with 3 gentle pecks of humor. Somewhere a medieval hen is proudly clucking. I've done more for truth than half the court system. If you ever feel judged, just imagine being stared down by a bird in front of a crowd. And truly, if your legal strategy involves a chicken and a crucifix, you are either divinely inspired or absolutely out of options. Painted on the walls, you're standing inside a tiny stone church, tucked into the corner of a sheep field, the kind that smells faintly of candle wax wool, and whatever sermon was last mumbled into the rafters. The walls are covered in faded frescoes, saints with solemn eyes, angels who look slightly exhausted, and one rooster. Perched in the background, head cocked like it's waiting to interrupt the gospel. Tonight's historical fact: roosters were not only buried beneath churches and perched on rooftops, they were also painted, carved, embroidered, and etched into the very fabric of medieval religious spaces. From grand cathedrals to humble chapels, rooster imagery appeared everywhere, often in places you wouldn't expect. Hidden in margins, tucked beside halos, watching, always watching. You move closer to the wall. The rooster's paint is chipped, but its silhouette is unmistakable. Standing tall behind St. Peter, its mid-crow beak, open feathers fluffed. It's not center stage, but it's there. Because no one forgets the bird that marked the moment of betrayal. The rooster's association with Peter's denial of Christ made it a favorite subject in religious art. You'll find it in altarpieces, mosaics, manuscript, illuminations, and even sculpted onto baptismal fonts. Not as decoration, but as narrative punctuation. The moment Peter hears the crow is the turning point, the wake-up call. And here's your quirky detail for tonight. In some 12th and 13th century churches, artists began sneaking roosters into non-biblical scenes. A depiction of the Last Supper. There's a rooster poking its head through a window. A scene of the resurrection. Look closely, one feathered witness at the tomb entrance. These were spiritual Easter eggs, quite literally. Roosters also appeared in marginalia those strange, whimsical little drawings that monks and scribes added to the edges of illuminated manuscripts. You might be reading the Psalms, and suddenly there's a rooster jousting with a snail, or a rooster in a bishop's hat, or a rooster pulling a cart full of monks. These images weren't just humorous, they were layered with meaning. Sometimes satire, sometimes warning, sometimes just boredom with too much ink and not enough supervision. In the stained glass windows of Chartres Cathedral, a rooster appears in the panel about Peter's denial. But look closer. It's not crowing. It's glowing, surrounded by rays of light, a visual reminder that even betrayal can be followed by redemption. And here's the academic squabble: were these roosters purely symbolic? Or did medieval viewers attribute a more mystical significance to their presence in art? Some argue that the rooster was meant to represent internal conscience, a feathery stand-in for that little voice saying, "You really shouldn't do that." Others claim the bird's presence reminded viewers of the passage of time and the need for constant vigilance. Art as alarm clock. In one rare 14th century manuscript from York, there's a miniature of the Nativity with a rooster watching from the stable rafters. No scriptural basis for it, just there, silent, feathered, watching as the world changed. Some interpret it as a symbol of prophecy, the crowing that would one day echo in Peter's ears, already watching from the moment of birth. Others say it was just the artist's way of saying, let's not forget the chicken. Even tomb carvings sometimes featured roosters. On a knight's grave in Burgundy, a tiny rooster is etched beside his family crest. Not a lion, not a sword, just a bird mid-crow. The inscription reads, "He woke when others slept." That's legacy. As you step back from the fresco, the rooster seems to meet your gaze. Unblinking, timeless, waiting for the next sleeper to stir. Let's perch on 3 artistic chuckles before bedtime. Somewhere a medieval monk sighed deeply and said, "Fine, I'll add the rooster again, but this is the last time it wears shoes." If your church art includes a rooster in a hat, you're either in a theological masterpiece or a poultry-themed fever dream. And truly, only the Middle Ages could turn a barnyard bird into both a metaphor for human frailty and an interior design choice. Cockerel currency. You're at a bustling village market on the edge of a cathedral town, dodging baskets of onions, loud opinions, and a goat that may or may not belong to anyone. Amid the swirl of smells, stale beer, smoked fish ambition, you notice something curious: a man trading a live rooster for a length of dyed wool. No coin changes hands, just bird for cloth, feather for fiber, and no one bats an eye. Tonight's historical fact: in some parts of medieval Europe, particularly in rural regions and smaller towns, roosters were sometimes used in place of currency. Not officially minted, of course, but as barter items of real recognized value, especially for small debts market trades, and yes, even religious tithes. The cockerel, it turns out, wasn't just sacred, he was negotiable. You crouch beside the wool merchant and listen in. 1 bird, 2 crows a day, still young, the seller says. Does he peck children? The buyer asks, squinting. Only the ones who deserve it. The deal is made. And this isn't strange. Not here. Not then. Chickens and roosters in particular were compact bundles of economic usefulness. They required little land-ate kitchen scraps, provided meat alarm services, and the occasional prophetic omen. For many peasants and smallholders, they were walking, clucking banknotes. In fact, some land taxes and church dues were expected to be paid in poultry. Especially in early medieval France and parts of England, vassals would send roosters to their lords during feast days as a form of acknowledgement and partial rent. Monasteries recorded dozens of such transactions, received one cock-brown aggressive temperament for Candlemas tithe. Here's your quirky historical footnote. In some villages, the quality of the rooster was directly tied to the quality of your soul. A quiet, humble bird, acceptable. A large, proud one, excellent. A lazy, uncooperative rooster, spiritually suspect. In one 12th century sermon, a priest compares stingy tithers to those who offer the Lord a molting bird who neither crows nor prays. And we can't forget the church's role in all this. It wasn't unusual for a peasant to bring a rooster as a votive offering a gift of thanks or penance. The birds were kept in special enclosures near the altar or in outbuildings tended by novices or church servants. Sometimes they were gifted onward to monasteries, sometimes eaten during feast days, and occasionally they just stuck around. One chapel in Burgundy famously had a rooster who lived on site for 7 years, never missing a mass. But not everyone saw the rooster as payment idea with fondness. Some lords began to resent being paid in squawk, particularly when trying to convert their holdings into silver. In a legal record from 1308, a nobleman in Normandy attempted to sue his tenant for deliberately offering the same rooster 3 times. The peasant insisted it was simply a faithful bird of many virtues. The court sided with the rooster. Here's your academic squabble of the evening: were roosters as currency a genuine economic fixture, or just a transitional barter item while rural economies caught up with minted systems? Some argue that poultry was part of a rich ecosystem of semi-standardized trade before coinage became reliable. Others believe it was more symbolic, ritualized, performative payment that reinforced loyalty and obligation more than it balanced the books. Either way, the image remains a solemn villager clutching a rooster like a wallet, hoping it doesn't squawk at the wrong time. You imagine walking into a medieval tavern, slapping a rooster on the counter and saying, "1 beer. Keep the change. Let's tally up 3 clucks of laughter before we close the ledger." Somewhere a peasant once whispered to his rooster, "If you crow twice, that wool better come with buttons." If someone handed you a chicken today instead of paying rent, you'd probably scream. In 1243, you'd say thank you and check its beak. And honestly, the only inflation problem was when the rooster thought he was worth 2 ducks. The cock in the choir. You're seated on a stone bench at the edge of a monastery choir loft. The air is thick with incense and the faint scent of something roasted, possibly theological. Beneath the arched ceilings, monks chant in low, measured tones, psalms rising and falling like waves on a particularly solemn ocean. And just before the final verse, a new voice joins the choir. Crow. A rooster, loud, unrepentant, perfect pitch. Tonight's historical fact: there are documented cases, especially in Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries, of roosters being allowed intentionally to roam within or near cloisters, including choir spaces. Not as pets, not as pest control, but as symbolic participants in the rhythm of daily prayer. These were not barnyard intruders. They were feathered timekeepers, occasionally depending on the abbey choir members too. Imagine the scene: matins 3:00 a.m. The monks are sleep-deprived but devout. The bell rings. The chapel is cold. Candles sputter. And just as the 3rd psalm begins, the monastery's rooster lets out a holy screech from the rafters. The monks pause. Some nod. One mutters under his breath, "Right on time." This wasn't merely tolerated. In some cases, it was welcomed. The rooster, after all, was already rich in religious symbolism. Its crowing marked repentance, Peter, again vigilance, monastic schedules, and the triumph of light over darkness every dawn since forever. In liturgical texts, the rooster's call was seen as a sacred signal, an echo of divine rhythm. So why not let it sing? In one 14th century abbey near Bruges, a particularly famous rooster named Dominicus Minor, Little Dominic, was listed in the Cloister records as Avis Temporis, bird of time. The monks claimed he never missed a service. When he died, they buried him behind the chapel beside the herbs. A tiny headstone read, "He crowed, we rose." But there's more. In a few curious cases, monks trained roosters, yes, trained to crow on cue, not just at dawn, but at certain parts of the service. In a French monastic play from the late 1200s, a live rooster was brought on stage during a performance of the Passion. It crowed after Peter's third denial, no special effects needed. The audience gasped. One woman fainted. The rooster was given a seed cake and a bow. Even in England, a manuscript from Durham refers to the choir cock, a bird that reportedly lived near the apse and was known for chanting with conviction. Whether this was a poetic monk being sarcastic or an actual avian vocalist is still debated, but we like to think it was both. Here's your academic feather. To ruffle some scholars, argue that these birds, in religious spaces, were symbolic, only kept nearby, but not in the choir. Others believe that rural monasteries, less constrained by formality, allowed for more immersive symbolism, especially when the animal's timing helped regulate the divine hours. Because, let's be honest, it's one thing to pray. It's another to be up at 2:45 a.m. with no clock, no sunlight, and no caffeine. A rooster that crowed at exactly the right time. That bird wasn't an animal. It was infrastructure. And while roosters are often associated with chaos, crowing at odd hours, chasing novices down corridors, flapping into the sacristy mid-vow monks didn't mind. Life was noisy. And faith was louder. One Dominican friar once wrote, "Let the rooster crow, for he does not speak of sleep, but of rising." And somewhere in the dimness, the bird fluffed his feathers and said, "You're welcome." 3 harmonious chuckles before the next hymn. Somewhere a monk once said, "He may not know Latin, but he nails the timing." If your choir director has feathers and pecks the songbook, you're probably in the right monastery. And truly, when the rooster outperforms you in morning prayer, it's time to reevaluate your vows. Saints and strutting birds. You're leafing through a dusty hagiography in a candlelit scriptorium, your fingers smudged with old ink, and someone else's centuries-old breadcrumbs. The page crackles as you turn it, expecting the usual, a saint, a miracle, maybe a healing or a polite resurrection. But instead, you find a rooster, a big one, strutting beside a man in a halo. The caption reads, "And the blessed bird did not forsake him." Tonight's historical fact: in some tales, both popular and sacred roosters weren't just symbols. They were companions. Occasionally, even miracle workers. A few saints throughout medieval Europe had stories involving unusually helpful chickens. And in the strange, sincere logic of hagiography, a rooster saving your life wasn't much weirder than surviving fire poison or 40 days without blinking. Take, for example, Saint Meinrad of Einsiedeln. A quiet hermit in what is now Switzerland, Meinrad was known for his hospitality. According to some versions of his legend, the only witness to his murder by thieves was a rooster who followed the culprits all the way back to town, crowing continuously until justice was served. Local villagers took it as divine judgment. The rooster, it's said, was rewarded with crumbs and prayers. Then there's the obscure case of St. Cuthbert's lost sermon notes, allegedly recovered thanks to a rooster who scratched them out from under a collapsed shelf. Probably fictional, but the story stuck. Some monks even kept feathered companions near their desks to stir the dust of forgotten thoughts. But perhaps the most fantastical feathered tale belongs to the anonymous saint, now nicknamed Gallinus, from the Latin for rooster. This shadowy figure appears in 3 14th century compilations of minor saints, all of which suggest that he was either visited by ministered to or transformed into a rooster. Yes, transformed. According to one French retelling, Gallinus was so devoted to vigilance that when he died, God let him return as a rooster to continue his watch over a church roof until the final trumpet. The monks, reportedly unfazed, named him Brother Clovis and let him peck bread during morning prayers. It's unclear whether Gallinus was ever officially canonized, but someone carved his likeness beak and all into the choir stalls of a Benedictine abbey. Scholars still argue whether it's satire or sincere devotion. Probably both. Now let's perch on the scholarly question: were these stories ever meant to be believed literally? Some historians argue that the tales were allegorical, meant to teach lessons about loyalty, humility, and attentiveness. Others note that in an age where saints turned rivers backwards and cured plague with eye contact, a rooster saving your soul wasn't even top 10 weird. The real value of these stories may lie in how they reflect medieval values. The rooster, despite his simplicity, embodied traits the church admired: courage, constancy, loud public announcements. In a time when most people couldn't read a bird that crowed at the right moment, was in many ways a preacher. Even in liturgical dramas, roosters were given roles sometimes offstage, sometimes in feathered costume. One 15th century performance in Prague reportedly ended with a monk declaring, "Blessed be the cock who crows at conscience," to which the audience understandably laughed. But the message remained: the rooster doesn't sleep. He watches. He warns. He remembers. And in some stories, he even forgives. Let's strut gently into 3 saintly chuckles. Somewhere a rooster is wondering why he got canonized for doing what he does every morning anyway. If your halo has feathers and you crow during mass congratulations, you're either a saint or you've deeply confused the bishop. And honestly, if you're remembered for crowing at the right moment, you've probably done better than half the nobility. Crowing at the end times. You're standing in the nave of a stone church so old it feels like it grew there. The stained glass is dull with centuries of dust. The wooden pews creak like they've heard too much, and somewhere above the altar, a rooster is carved into the archbeak, open wings flared as if mid-prophecy. You tilt your head. The rooster isn't blessing anyone. It's warning them. Tonight's historical fact: in certain medieval apocalyptic texts and sermons, the rooster played a surprising role not just as a symbol of vigilance or faith, but as a harbinger of the last judgment. Yes, when the world ends and the trumpets sound, some believe the rooster might be the first to crow. It wasn't a mainstream doctrine, but it was persistent in popular belief. You'll find traces of it in mystery plays, early woodcuts, and especially in rural preaching, where metaphors had to flap and squawk to stick. One English preacher in the 13th century declared, "As the cock crows before the light, so shall the cock cry out at world's end to rouse the dead from sleep." That'll get a congregation's attention. The logic was poetic. The rooster heralds the dawn. What then is more fitting than for it to also herald the final dawn? The last morning, the morning when all mornings end, you step closer to the altar. A stone relief depicts the second coming clouds, parting angels with trumpets, and tucked beside them a rooster, barely noticeable, but there, crowing toward the rising dead like it's been waiting for this day the whole time. In some traditions, this idea of the rooster's apocalyptic crow blended with local legend. One Breton tale speaks of the black rooster of silence, a spectral bird said to only crow once in the very last hour of time. No one who hears it lives to see the next hour, because there isn't one. Other stories tell of the golden cock, a divine bird who crows thrice when the heavens open and the earth gives up its bones. The first crow wakes the saints. The second wakes the sinners. The third calls everyone to judgment. It's powerful, dramatic imagery, and it worked. Preachers in villages often leaned into this metaphor when describing the end of days. If the rooster crowed at an unusual hour or 3 times in a row, people sometimes took it as a sign to confess pray, or at the very least apologize to someone they'd side-eyed at the market. But of course, not all took this literally. Scholars have long debated whether the rooster's place in apocalyptic tradition was symbolic or sincerely feared. Some argue that it was purely literary, a feathered metaphor of spiritual awakening. Others insist that for the illiterate majority raised on sermons and plays rather than scripture, the rooster's cry had a deeply ingrained urgency. It meant wake up. Now. This might be it. And there's beauty in that, really. The idea that the creature we hear every day, often ignore, sometimes curse before coffee, might also be the one to sing the final stanza of history. No trumpet, no fire, no fanfare. Just a clear, defiant crow over the world's last sunrise. Some cathedrals even placed rooster imagery high above their altars, or carved them into the backs of pews, not just as Peter's reminder, but as quiet heralds. Silent until the day they wouldn't be. As the candles flicker low and the stone beneath your feet sighs with ancient weight, you can almost hear it, not in fear, but in peace. The crow that says, wake up, look around, you are here, and time still moves. 3 quiet crows before the close, somewhere a rooster is stretching its neck and thinking, end times, better warm up first. If the world ends to the sound of a chicken, at least it'll be punctual. And truly, if Judgment Day comes with feathers and flair, honestly, that feels right. So now you're lying still, somewhere between a blanket and a dream, drifting soft as parchment in candlelight. The roosters have all gone quiet, no more midnight warnings or dawn declarations. Just the hush of feathers, settling of stories, nestling into the corners of your mind. We've walked alongside birds who were buried beneath churches, painted into gospels, blamed for betrayal, and praised for prophecy. Creatures that crowed at saints, strutted through sermons, interrupted prayers, and sometimes announced the end of the world. Not bad for an animal most people now meet only as breakfast. And maybe that's the wonder of it all. That something as ordinary as a rooster, loud, awkward, inexplicably confident, once held so much weight in the rhythm of faith and fear. They reminded people to rise to repent, to laugh and to listen. Not to the noise, but to the meaning behind it. As your thoughts start to dim and soften, you can imagine them still, one perched on a chapel rooftop, another carved into the wood of a pew, one buried quietly under centuries of stone, not forgotten, just waiting. So if you hear a distant crow in the morning or dream of feathers brushing past your thoughts, don't worry. It's just history, gently checking if you're still awake. That's the story. For tonight, may your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.